All right, welcome back to the channel for another video on the sub 2 3-valve 4.6 2005 Mustang GT. What is going on here? Well, guess what? I had a whole bunch of videos that I made swapping the stock cams back into the motor to smog the car, and I got the cams back in the car with all the rest of the mods on it still, just figuring I'd do the cams first, get it running. Once I verify everything's good, then I'll swap all the exhaust and everything in the intake manifold. So I got the cams in, everything went super smooth. Fired right up, sounded super normal, smooth. Thinking, great, can I go take it for a drive, see how it feels with the stock cams in it and all the mods. Got to the gas station, put some gas in it. On the way back home, I got to about 3,500 after it was starting to warm up a little bit. And it changed. It went from sounding normal to sounding very upset and not really going anywhere. So instantly I let off and it started running like crap. And by that I mean it was chugging and popping and sounded like crap. Barely ran till I got home. It stayed running, but it was just running down on a bunch of cylinders, it felt like. Got it home, was trying to figure out what the heck just happened. Threw a code for passenger side cam over retarded, and so I assumed that what happened was the cam somehow came free or broke free from the phaser, and I had valve contact on the pistons. It sounded like it was running on 4 cylinders, and I unplugged each coil and each fuel injector on the right hand side one at a time, and it didn't change the RPM at all. So obviously I'm thinking it's got a dead. The whole passenger side cylinder head was no compression. It wasn't making any power at all. So without doing any research, I assumed I had bent all my exhaust valves. Pulled the head off and none of the valves had touched the piston. And all the valves passed a leak test with some Windex. So at that point, I was just completely committed. Had both heads off already and decided, you know what? I might as well have them rebuilt, have a valve job done. I'll do some porting on them, and I'll put it back together. During that time, I did some research and discovered that what happened was a not super common, but somewhat common issue with the VCT solenoid failing. Why it failed, I don't know. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. I'm not 100% certain, but I have zero other explanation. I had good sealing on all the valves. From what I could tell in the timing chain, all the timing marks matched up. The only thing that was strange was that the passenger side cam phaser that controls the VCT, it wasn't locked when I was turning it over by hand after I took it all apart. So from what I could tell, everything was still lined up on the chains and the sprockets. But when I was turning it over by hand with the spark plugs out, I noticed that the passenger side cam clicked back and forth a couple of times as I was running it through. And that happens when the cam lobes get on the springs one way or the other and it kicks it back. Well, the phaser is supposed to be locked out when the motor's not running. And I swapped the phaser out and I tried to start it up again and it sounded exactly the same. So the phaser wasn't working properly, but also changing it out didn't change anything. So it had to be VCT solenoid. That's what I'm going on. Now I've got freshly rebuilt heads. They got all brand new guides. As you can see here, we got a fresh valve job and everything. We got a fresh surface on the head. So had the head surfaced a little bit, which technically raises compression ratios slightly because it reduces the size of the chamber. Not dramatically, but it does raise it a little bit. I'm going to lose pretty much all of that when I go to unshroud the valves a little bit. So I'm going to port the heads. This will be my third set of 3-valve heads that I've ported because of the fiasco that happened with my last motor. So, and if you haven't seen that or heard about that, it's in one of the older videos from a couple years ago. But anyways, I'm going to do some mild porting. There's really, honestly, not a whole lot to port here. You can see, like, down here, um, there's a ridge right there. So basically, I'm just going to smooth out all the stuff in the bowl areas. Make sure that the ports match well to the seats. And we got good flow through there. All these ports have a little bit of a step in them. So like I said, I'm not going to get crazy. With the stock size valves, mild cams, stock intake, no power adder, no big cams, no big intake, no high compression, no stroker. These heads flow pretty well as they are, and I'm not going to gain a whole lot by just porting the crap out of them. So I'm going to clean them up. I'll probably gain 5 horsepower or something stupid like that. But I just can't put it back together stock. That being said, these heads were pretty much in need of a valve job. So I assume the motor only has about 65,000 miles on it. But the guy that I got the motor from tracked this car 30 or 40 times before I got the motor. And I've tracked it about 10 times on this motor. So this motor has had a lot of hard miles on it. And I don't treat it nice when I'm not on the track either. Not all the time, but I rip on it a pretty good amount. So most of the exhaust valve guides were pretty shot. A lot of wobble in the valves. Some of the intakes were not good. The biggest thing though was that most of all the exhaust valves had a lot of pitting around the seat and around the valve. That comes from just use, high heat, racing situations over long periods of time. So I was probably losing some compression through the valves. So now we're all freshened up, should have the full amount of compression that it's supposed to have when it's stock. And yeah, I'm going to have a little more airflow. Let me turn these over real quick. So I've actually already done porting on these heads before. So when I got this motor, I had a Ford Racing intake manifold that I had ported to match the heads that I ported on my first engine. So with a ported intake manifold, you have an enlarged port. And if you don't match the head to that port, now you've got a very hard step that the airflow is going to hit to get into the port. So what I did was I opened up, while these heads were on the engine still, before I put it in the car ever, I ported all these intake runners out to match them to my Ford Racing intake manifold. I no longer have that manifold. I have a stock manifold with a CMCV deletes on it that I've ported that. So I've now matched my stock intake manifold with the deletes to these ports. I'm going to actually take the plates off and mount them to the heads so I can get a more accurate port match, because before it was just done by taking a few measurements and stuff like that. So hopefully now I'll have a really nice port match. I'll probably clean these up a little bit more. Honestly, I'm not going to gain a whole lot by opening up these at all. A very small amount. The exhaust side is the tight side on flow. But basically, the worst part about these heads is the throat area down in here where the valve stem comes through. So you have that blocking airflow and taking up area. You also have these bumps in here on both sides, and that's for the spark plug runs through there. You see that, how it kind of comes through at that angle? See those humps on both sides? That's blocking a lot of air and choking it down right in this throat area, the bowl area. So I'm gonna try and open up, get rid of some of that a little bit, but again, I'm not gonna get carried away because in the grand scheme of things, it's not gonna do a whole lot. The exhaust ports, they're pretty well matched to the seat, but I'm gonna try and clean that up a little bit. Smooth this. There's a hump on these right here. I'm gonna try and smooth that out. I'll probably enlarge the exhaust ports just a hair. Again, I'm not gonna get carried away, but the exhaust ports are pretty small. So you don't want to touch the floors really. I'll polish them, but I'm not gonna do much to the floor. All the airflow is at the roof of the port. So I'm gonna open those up, probably widen them out just a hair. But yeah, I'm not gonna get carried away. The guy who did the head work on this is the same guy who did the heads on my last motor. Those had an exhaust valve fail, and it failed because the guides wore out, and all I can find through all the stuff that I dug through and information was that I basically chose the wrong valve springs for the cam. That's on me. Wasn't on Ted for the machine work he did on the head. So that was my first engine that I put a hole in a piston because the exhaust valve failed. Because the valves or the guides wore out so bad, so quickly, the guide or the valve was just rocking around like crazy, and it just eventually either floated and hit the piston or just snapped off, and it bounced around in here and took out the other two valves and took out the piston and everything else. Took out the whole head, I basically just gave up on that motor, put another used motor in it, which is what these are from. So anyways, I've been talking way too much, and now I'm probably confusing people, but long story short, the car is going back to stock so I can smog it, and then everything else goes back on the car. I probably will run the stock cams for a little bit just because that's a little more work than just swapping exhaust and intake. And so I'm going to run stock cams. After I smog it, I'm going to put all the stuff back on the car minus the cams, the Ford Racing cams, for a little bit, see how it feels. Honestly, the Ford Racing cams on track probably aren't buying me a whole lot. They sound awesome, and they do give some more top-end power. Not a ton, maybe 15, 20, 25 horsepower tops. So anyways, we're going to port these heads. I'll show you guys how that looks. Then I have to reassemble everything, get it back in the car. The goal is to have this thing running by tomorrow night. That would be super awesome. It'll be all stock minus the catback. But hopefully, fingers crossed, it'll all be back together and everything will be okay. It'll be running good, and I can move on with this chapter of my life. So anyways, again, the plan is to clean up the ports just a little bit. I'm going to do some unshrouding of the valves. So by that, I mean, see like this sharp lip right here? So as the valve opens, this whole section blocks the valve from flowing air out over here. Sounds really bad, but in the grand scheme of things, not a huge deal because, again, most of the airflow comes on the back side of the port here and out this side of the valve. So there's not a ton of airflow. Anyways, the valve opens up and it's right against the cylinder wall over here. So you're not getting a whole lot of airflow on this side of the valve anyways, and most of it's going to be over here, which, if you think about it, is kind of where you want it because you want it to fill up the center of the cylinder as the air comes in here and mixes around as the piston's pulling away. You want the fuel and the air up, the fuel to get up against the cylinder walls. You want it to be mostly in the center. So I'm going to unshroud a little bit. You also don't want sharp edges. There's a lot of sharp edges in here. The sharp edges can get hot under high heat conditions like racing. These little sharp edges can get hot and cause knocking or pinging, and that's not good if you know anything about that. So you can burn a hole in a piston, you can melt a piston land, you can melt exhaust valves, you can do a lot of stuff. What happens is something like this will get really hot, and then it'll ignite the fuel before the spark plug does, and so it ignites before the piston's at top dead center or close to top dead center, and it makes the piston shake and rattle, and it just creates a bunch of extra heat, and it's bad for everything. So I'm going to smooth out some of that stuff. Some of these sharp edges I'll clean up a little bit, but again, this is going to be a real mild port work here because, again, it's not going to buy me a whole lot, but I just can't bring myself to putting it back together stock because it's just the way I am. So anyways, way too much talking, not enough doing. I need to start grinding away on these port heads, and I hope to everything holy that I don't hit one of these seats with a porting tool, because then we'll have to go back to the machine guy and might have to have his seat replaced, and that just creates a whole nother fiasco. So again, I'm not going to get carried away because I don't want to ruin these heads. They're pretty, they're nice, they just need a little bit of cleanup work. So anyways, way too much talking. Let me get to work. All right, so I've pretty much finished this one cylinder here. So, as you can see, it's not like fully polished, ported everywhere, but, and obviously you're not going to be able to completely compare just by looking through a video, but basically now I have no more of these sharp edges for the air to catch as it comes out. Everything is nice and smooth. Not polished, but smooth. Much better than this cast surface. You can hear that. So anyways, It's really hard to see the difference, but basically open up the throats a little bit, kind of ground out some of this hump. Can't get too crazy because you'll grind through into the spark plug chamber where the spark plug's at. So smooth all that out, smooth everything into the seats so there's no more of these sharp lips like that everywhere. Again, just kind of fine tuning. And then you can see right here how I laid these really sharp steps right here. So I laid these back so as the valve opens up, pretty much at lower lift is the only time it's really going to do much. As the valve begins to open, instead of being almost totally blocked like it is on this side, it'll be able to flow out. I'm willing to bet they did this for low RPM efficiency and like tumbling of the air. Not so great for ultimate flow. If you look at all the ported 3-valve heads, all of these are super laid back, so they really relieve these valve areas right here. I did that on my first set of heads. I'm not getting crazy on these. I don't think there's a huge advantage to going super laid back like that. It takes out a ton of combustion chamber area that reduces compression ratio. So I don't really want to do that. I just kind of wanted to clean up everything. Also, you can see like along these edges. So what I did was I put the head gasket on here and I basically port matched to where the head gasket comes around. So the cylinder itself, so when the air comes out, it flows smoothly instead of getting tripped, especially like on the exhaust side as it's pushing into the valve area. If the gasket is like right here, but the port is over here, or the chamber's over here, as the air is coming in, it's going to get tripped and cause turbulent air to go through there instead of it being a smooth transition from the cylinder wall into the valve seat area. So just little stuff like that. Honestly, probably not going to make a massive difference. And again, this side's kind of hard because these were already kind of ported before. I went in there and cleaned them up a little bit more. It's really hard to see. Need a flashlight. But anyways, they don't look nice. See, these are kind of polished because the guy did the heads, ran a wire wheel through there and kind of polished them up. Polished surfaces on the exhaust side tend to help, but a polished surface on the intake side has been proven not to really do a whole lot. So let me show you the exhaust side here. It's probably the largest changes happen on the exhaust side, which is where these heads really need it. So you can see here that I've put the exhaust gasket on there and basically matched up the holes and everything, right? And I did a Sharpie mark around there, and so now that's right to the gasket. And honestly, that's not a lot of material to remove. I mean, you're talking 1/16 of an inch or so. It's not a lot of area, but you can look in here and you can just kind of tell that it's got a lot more runner area in it, and it's much smoother. There's less ridges and humps and bumps and everything else. So again, probably not going to make a huge difference, but I can't leave it alone. So it is what it is. Yeah, and also I studied a lot of pictures of like aftermarket CNC ported heads just to get an idea of what they did. On my first set of heads, I actually went quite a bit bigger than this. I went probably way too big. Again, you kind of got to port for what you're doing. So this is a mild engine. It doesn't need giant ports. I have stock exhaust. I have stock size valves. So going really big on a port isn't going to do much if you're still running stock size valves. So let's kind of another view here. See if you can kind of get an idea of the size difference and the smoothness inside versus, it's kind of hard to see the stock ones because they're rough inside and don't reflect light. But anyways, yeah, so I think that's as far as I'm going to go. So I just got 7 more to do. I think that took me about an hour, maybe an hour and a half to do that. Probably about an hour. So anyways, you can see the texture on the casting on the ports. So that'll all be nice and smooth like this. And yeah, should be good. Hopefully just these little changes will you know, 5-10 horsepower. I'd be happy with that. That's to be expected. The feel, if you were to run your fingers through here, huge difference. Like I can only get my thumb to about right here before it stops, and here I can get it all the way through. There's no resistance. So I mean, that's crude obviously, but just goes to show you how much it's been opened up, the port, how much the port's been opened up. So big difference on these inside radiuses right here, where these castings don't really meet up with the valve seats. Again, this is the lowest airspeed area, so, and it's turbulent through here because it's turning so sharp. So doing changes to this area here isn't going to do a whole lot, but it's better than nothing. So most of the air, like I said before, comes on the back side of the wall here. That's where the high-speed air is. Anyways, that's where we're at. I probably won't show anything else until I finish all of these. All right, so that's the first head. It took about 3.5 hours. Again, it's not perfect. It's not beautiful like a CNC ported head. Sure, there's a little bit left I could do, but the gains you would get from being just fully worked over versus this horsepower too, and I just don't feel like putting in the effort for all that. So obviously everything's still dirty, needs to be cleaned, but everything looks pretty even, feels pretty even, much smoother now. All those sharp edges around here are all gone. You can see I marked out where the head gasket goes and try to kind of get these to match up with the cylinder wall a little bit. And yeah, so that's that for the first head. Gonna start the second head, hoping to just power through it and finish it tonight, and then tomorrow I can clean everything and start assembly on the heads and then start putting everything in the car. So I'm really hoping to have this thing running by tomorrow night. So we'll see. So that'll probably end this video because it's already way too long. But yeah, I mean overall, I think it turned out pretty good. Again, it's all a bunch of dust in there and everything. But you see, got some shavings in here. That's why I put this blanket up here so I wouldn't get all over my RC stuff. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you in the next one when the heads are assembled and we're putting the car back together. Alright, so finished last night. Took about 6 hours. Again, they aren't perfect, but most of the gains that I'm going to get have been achieved. You could work these things to death and make them perfect and polished and all that stuff, but in the grand scheme of things, it wouldn't buy you much. Not on these heads. So anyways, that's it. Just got them all cleaned up. It's time to get the shop cleaned up and then get these things put back together.